Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Inanna Hamati-Ataya and I'm the founding director of GLONOS, the Center for Global Knowledge Studies at the University of Cambridge. And it is truly a pleasure to welcome you and welcome Tahu Kukutai to our 2021 annual lecture series. Dr. Kukutai is professor at the National Institute of Demographic and Economic Analysis at the University of Waikato in Aotearoa, also known as New Zealand, where she specializes in Maori and Indigenous population research and leads several research programs and projects, including the fascinating collaborative project Ethnicity Counts, with a question mark, which tracks and compares ethnic counting practices of governments around the world, notably in national census campaigns. In addition to recent publications on this topic, I believe a book with Victor Thompson is forthcoming that examines how and why state practices of ethnic, racial, and civic enumeration have changed in the past decades. Related to this topic, but perhaps closer to the conversation we will be having with Professor Kukutai today, is her extensive work on Indigenous data sovereignty. So you will probably be aware of at least one of the two volumes that she recently co-edited for the Australian National University Press and Routledge, respectively, on this topic, as well as a range of articles addressing different aspects of this important issue. This includes most recently 2 interventions on how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected Indigenous populations in this respect and exacerbated existing inequalities, data injustices, and patterns of epistemic exclusion. I think this is the first time since we established the annual lecture series that we've had any substantial discussion on the use of big data, and especially ethnicity data. And so I'm really pleased that we are inaugurating this conversation with a perspective that is centered on the lived experiences, concerns, and knowledge practices of Indigenous populations. So I'm very grateful to Tahu for accepting my invitation, and we've all been really looking forward to her talk. Before handing over to Professor Kukutai, a few words about the organization of the session. So we are a small audience at this point, and thank you for joining us from probably different time zones. During the talk, I will ask everyone to make sure that their microphones are muted. Professor Kukutai will present for about maybe 40 minutes or however long she needs. And then we will open the floor to questions and comments from the audience. So I hope that since this is a small group, you will not be too shy. You can also submit your questions in the chat box during the talk, and then we can read them, and hopefully we'll have time to address all of the questions before the end of the session. Tahu, welcome again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Inanna. So, ko te mea tuatahi ngā mihi atu ki a koutou. Greetings to you all from the University of Waikato, which is situated on the lands of the Waikato people, from whom I hail. I'd like to acknowledge Inanna. Thank you very much for inviting me to contribute to your lecture series this summer. And also to Samantha, thank you very much for ensuring that everything runs smoothly today, here, and tonight where you are. So I've been invited to have a conversation around Indigenous data sovereignty. And so I guess I come to this conversation as a scholar, as an activist, as an advocate, as an advisor to central government, and as a technical advisor to our Tribal Leaders Forum. And this might sound a bit confusing. That is quite an array of hats to wear, but I do keep it simple. And I keep it simple because I have a fairly clear vision of what my why is. Why do I do this? Why do I care? Why does it matter? And for me, the why is, it's really about putting Indigenous data in Indigenous hands for Indigenous benefit. And that's really what it is. So I guess for the next 40 minutes, I sort of want to talk about that and, unpack some of the complexities that sits underneath what's an apparently very simple statement. So I've resisted the temptation to prepare a paper that I will read for 40 minutes because I think that will definitely send you into snoring land, and I'm mindful that it's 10 p.m. in the UK. But I will at times draw from some of my published work, and thank you very much, Inanna, for giving that really wonderful summary of some of the recent work. So I will at times draw on some of the published work, and in doing so, I particularly want to acknowledge my colleague, Associate Professor Donna Cormack, who is also one of the founders of the Maori data sovereignty movement here in Aotearoa, and with whom I've had the privilege of writing a number of papers over the years on the topic of Indigenous data sovereignty. So I'm now going to share my screen, and hopefully this works fine. So let's start with data. Social practices, interactions, and relations are increasingly being turned into data, driven by technologies that enable new methods of data accumulation, digitization, integration, and manipulation. The statification of human life and non-human life is not only transforming social relationships, it's also reshaping social science through the generation of data sets that open up new avenues for research and generate new ideas and debates about the relationship between data, digitalization, ethics, and human well-being. So increasingly here in Aotearoa, and probably where you are as well, data is being talked about as the world's most valuable resource. And you can see here I've got the cover from The Economist magazine. And then there's the accompanying hyperbole about data as being the new oil, where data is a resource to be extracted, exploited, dug out, and turned into huge profits for those with the know-how and the resources to do so. Here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, as you can see from the slide, there's been a fair amount of replaying of the value of data narrative. And there's a real appetite to be seen to be leading the world in data innovation. Aotearoa is part of the Digital Nations, or DN for short, which is a network of the world's most advanced digital nations who have a shared goal of, I quote, harnessing digital technology and new ways of working to improve citizens' lives. Some of the core principles that DN partners sign up to is open source, open data, open markets, and open government. So the DN network was previously known as D5, and then it became D7, and then it became D9, and then they just kept letting nations in and changed it to DN. And this DN network currently includes 10 members, and that includes Aotearoa New Zealand and also the United Kingdom. And both New Zealand and the UK were in the original D5 when it formed in 2004, along with Korea, Estonia, and Israel. So over the past 5 or 6 years in particular, there's been very strong claims made about the value and the power of data. Our National Statistics Office, Stats New Zealand, once the bastion of conservative data gatekeeping, has a tagline now about, and you can see it here on the slide, unleashing the power of the data to change lives. And the now disbanded New Zealand Data Futures Forum, which was set up by the Ministers of Finance and Statistics, had a pretty grand ambition for New Zealand to be a world leader in the trusted use of shared data to deliver a prosperous but also an inclusive society. You know, and that's a pretty grand deliverable given the growing levels of inequality here in Aotearoa, which disproportionately impacts Maori and Pacific communities, and the consistently lower level of trust towards government institutions that has been for a long time documented among these groups in nationally representative surveys like the General Social Survey. So amidst this sort of hyperbole around the value of the data, one's compelled to ask who is doing the unleashing and the unlocking, on whom, what purpose, according to whose values, and for whose benefit. How we answer these questions might lead us to very different ways of thinking about trusted data use. Certainly in my day job as a demographer who, for want of a better term, deals in data, there can be an uncritical and somewhat naive understanding of data. And to data analysts who provide access, who see their data analysis as providing access to a higher order truth, if you like. Data points are seen as self-evident facts with little regard to their cultural and political context. Such thinking is, of course, misguided. There's multiple ways for data misspeak to creep in, especially when the focus is on identifying subpopulations for the purpose of intervention. Indigenous data scholars and activists have theorised how contemporary data practices and relations represent a continuation of the processes and the underlying belief systems of extraction, exploitation, accumulation, and dispossession that have been visited on Indigenous populations through historical colonisation and ongoing colonialism. So it goes without saying that Indigenous peoples have had fraught experiences with data collections controlled by others, not the least of which is the state. Like many other Indigenous peoples, Maori have often found ourselves as the problem to be solved and have a keen sense of the power of the data and what we might call data harms. You know, in some ways, this isn't new. Powerful people have long recognised the power of the data. The word census derives from the Latin word censere, meaning to tax or assess, and its origins in antiquity coincide with the rise of the early Chinese, Egyptian and Roman states and their extraction of resources from the population, either through taxation, labour or military conscription. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, learned white men called on the science of statistics to investigate the linkages between societal conditions and health, and to really try and identify precision-like laws of society akin to those of Newtonian mechanics. And the focus of these investigations were often the working poor, and the goal was often to monitor and control. Here in Aotearoa, Maori, the Indigenous peoples, and tribes specifically, were undeniably the objects of data surveillance. And the motivation for the data collection was largely one of data in pursuit of domination, and then later assimilation, and then when that failed, economic incorporation. And there's many contemporary examples, most recently reports of police taking photos of Maori youth on the streets to potentially upload those images into databases using facial recognition software. There's many, a long list of contemporary examples of data surveillance of the Indigenous population here. The bigger point is that more often than not, the requirements and the priorities of government have taken precedence over Indigenous informational needs and priorities. Now, I don't want to be a data downer and say that data is all bad. I mean, I use a lot of data in my day job, so data isn't all bad, and there are important opportunities for data to be used in ways that can improve the quality of people's lives, to contribute to wise decision-making, to empower citizen decision-making, but not if the power resides in the hands of a few. So government agencies collecting, storing, analysing information about people tilts the balance of power from the people towards government. And in the absence of a robust regulatory framework and data governance mechanisms, we run the risk of data being something that's done to people rather than by and for the people. And for Maori's Indigenous peoples, we run the risk of replicating a colonial system that we know has been used to disempower us. So that was sort of a long preamble to Indigenous data sovereignty, but I think context matters. So I wanted to provide some of that context. So now I want to focus on Indigenous data sovereignty. And, you know, it was these concerns and I guess the context of the rapid expansion of data linkage and integration here in Aotearoa New Zealand that led to a workshop on Indigenous data sovereignty in Canberra, neighbouring Australia in 2015. And that was supported by the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia and was followed shortly thereafter by the co-edited book with my colleague John Taylor on Indigenous data sovereignty toward an agenda, and most of the participants in that earlier workshop provided chapters for this book. And here I just want to acknowledge the stunning artwork that graced the cover of the book, which was a collaboration between Tlingit artist Preston Singletary and Maori artist Lewis Tamihana Gardner. And what I love here is the sense of moving into uncharted territories together, guided by our own ways of knowing, and bringing with us human and non-human relationships. And I think this ethos has really infused the international collaborative work of the various Indigenous data sovereignty networks, who I'm going to talk a little bit about shortly. So I think when you're talking about anything with the language might not be well known, it's important to try and define the terms. And thank you, Inanna, for putting this in context, that this is probably the first talk on sort of big and open data type issues that you've had in this lecture series. So I'll bear that in mind as I work through. So data sovereignty is largely sort of a mainstream terminology that's really around jurisdiction. And the European Union's GDPR is sort of an example of data sovereignty that tries to bring data regulation firmly under regional jurisdiction. And many other countries are also trying to regulate how data can be stored and transmitted and used. And there's many other examples, which I won't sort of take a deep dive into, otherwise we'll never get through the presentation. But suffice to say that the shared assumption is that the locus of control is the nation state. So Indigenous data sovereignty really sort of turns that notion on its head. And it's really about tribal nations and Indigenous nations and our rights to govern the collection, the ownership, and the application of our own data. And this derives from tribal nations' inherent right to govern their peoples and lands and resources. And these inherent rights have been recognised in global human rights instruments, for example, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to which Aotearoa New Zealand is a signatory, and also treaties in different national and domestic contexts. And that example there, I've just got US IDSM, that's from the United States Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network. So that sort of in a nutshell is the concept of Indigenous data sovereignty, and I'll unpack that a little bit more as we go through. So since the publication of the book, Indigenous data sovereignty networks and activities have really proliferated, and national IDSov networks have been established here in Aotearoa New Zealand. On the top left-hand corner there is Te Mana Raranga, which is the Maori Data Sovereignty Network. Also, networks have been established in the United States, 2 networks in Australia, emerging ones in the Pacific, and also there's growing interest in Scandinavia, Mexico, South America, and Southeast Asia. And these sites of activism and advocacy build on the foundations laid by the pioneering First Nations Information Governance Centre in Canada, which is widely regarded as the original Indigenous data sovereignty network. They didn't use the language of Indigenous data sovereignty, but absolutely that was fundamentally what they were doing, was laying the foundations, and really want to acknowledge that all networks that have subsequently come after the FNIGC have really benefited from decades of commitment and sacrifice laid down by those communities and thought leaders. There's now at least 2 international Indigenous data sovereignty networks, one which is affiliated with the influential Research Data Alliance, which some of you may know about, which is a global network. And the other one is a network of networks known as the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, down on the bottom right-hand corner. I'll talk about them a little bit more. And most of the people involved in the founding of their domestic data sovereignty networks were also involved in the founding of this Global Indigenous Data Alliance. So collectively, Indigenous scholars, practitioners, and activists involved in these networks have worked together and independently to increase recognition of IDSov as both an expression and an enabler of Indigenous rights, Indigenous wellbeing, and Indigenous self-determination. There's also a growing sense, certainly here in Aotearoa, which I'll talk about a bit more, that IDSov offers an alternative and potentially transformative vision of good data practices with possible benefits that might extend beyond Indigenous communities. So to date, these networks have largely focused on self-organisation, outreach and awareness. Most networks have published their own IDSov charters, principles, guidelines, engaged in public advocacy and media commentary around specific IDSov issues. This was particularly visible during the pandemic and acknowledging the disproportionate impacts of the pandemic on Indigenous communities in many countries. And networks have actively socialised IDSov concepts and principles within Indigenous communities, but also within government agencies. And despite having really different contexts, political contexts, regulatory contexts, historical contexts, the one thing, well, there's several things, but one key thing that all of these networks share is a focus on self-determination. So the concept of self-determination is closely connected to the articulation of Indigenous peoples' rights in the UN DRIP and domestic treaties. Here in Aotearoa, those include He Whakatupuranga, the 1835 Declaration of Independence, and Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the 1840 Treaty of Waitangi between the Maori tribes and representatives of Queen Victoria. A central tenet of Indigenous self-determination is that Indigenous peoples have an inherent right to be in control of our destinies and to create our own political and legal organisations. Although self-determination is central to global human rights and Indigenous rights discourses, there are also domestic nuances that IDSov must speak to. Here it has been argued that the Maori concept of tino rangatiratanga, which can be defined as absolute chiefly authority, offers a stronger right for Maori than the Western paradigm of self-determination, and that tino rangatiratanga exists independently of state sovereignty, and that it exists whether the state recognises it or not. So I want to segue now into speaking a little bit about our Māori Data Sovereignty Network here in Aotearoa. It's no coincidence that the language used here is te mana raraunga. Mana or mana motuhake is a very closely aligned concept to tino rangatiratanga in terms of authority. So this sort of loosely translates to having authority over the data. That's the name of the network. And Te Mana Raraunga is really a network of a voluntary network. Nobody's paid. There is no formal legal entity. We get together because we care about this stuff. And as many data practitioners, academics, activists and communities, we're all Indigenous. It is Indigenous-led, and we have non-Indigenous allies who support our kaupapa or purpose. And the sort of overarching purpose of this network is to advocate for the development of capacity and capability across the Māori data ecosystem, and that includes data rights and interests, data governance, data storage and security, and data access and control. There's the URL there for the website, and there's also a Twitter handle if you want to sort of check out. There's a lot of resources on the website, lots of public statements taken on government agencies, various resources that our network members have created, and lots of links to other Indigenous data sovereignty networks, because we very much see ourselves as being part of a global community. So again, sort of returning to that idea of defining terms so that we don't sort of talk past each other, one of the questions that really arose in the early days when we were talking about Māori data sovereignty was, what's Māori data? How do you even define such a thing? Is it just sort of cultural, customary knowledge that is owned by Indigenous communities, or is it something much broader than that? And certainly the way that we've chosen to define it in terms of our network has taken a much more broader and inclusive definition of Māori data. So this comes from the Māori Data Sovereignty Principles, and Māori data really refers to information or knowledge that is in a digital or digitizable form that is about or from Māori peoples and our environments, regardless of who controls it. And if we only defined Māori data in terms of data that's actually possessed or controlled by Māori people, we'd be talking about a very small amount of data, because data colonialism being what it is, most of the data that has come from Māori people and still continues to be collected is actually controlled by someone else, controlled by other organisations. So just to sort of disaggregate that a bit, that includes Māori from data from Māori, which is self-generated. That includes tribal nations, Māori businesses, Māori organisations, data about Māori that's generated by others. A good example is the census, which happens every 5 years here. I think it's every 10 years in the UK. Health data, which is becoming an incredibly important area, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the regulations that have come out around health data, and particularly in a global context, and data about Māori resources. And of particular importance here is data around Māori land. So, like I said, the Data Sovereignty Network here, and most of the data sovereignty networks have published their own principles as kind of guides to understanding what data sovereignty means in a particular context. And so I'm not going to go through all the principles from our network here, but I'll highlight a few of them just so that it sort of, I think it really sort of crystallizes what the different approach looks like. And here just to highlight that, you know, it's not data for data's sake. But it's really about the ethical use of data to enhance the well-being of our people, of our language, of our culture. So we only have a single language here, Indigenous language here in Aotearoa New Zealand. It makes us very different from our Indigenous colleagues in the United States and Canada and Australia, who have hundreds of distinctive Indigenous languages. What it means for us is that we're able to incorporate our single language that has some dialectical differences but can be understood readily across every tribe. We are able to incorporate our language and our knowledge systems sort of more readily into our resources so that it really speaks to our communities, and that we can try and communicate our own approach to data on our own terms using our own language. So I just want to highlight a few of the principles here. There's 6 main principles, and then some of them are disaggregated. And the first one here goes back to the concept that I talked about initially about rangatiratanga on authority. And the first sub-principle here is around the very key issue of control. And it states very unambiguously that Māori have an inherent right to exercise control over Māori data. When it comes to jurisdiction, wherever possible, Māori data, and we've already defined what Māori data is, shall be stored here in Aotearoa New Zealand, not offshore. This is a key point of tension at the moment because the government's strategy is really to offshore all government data. And so this insistence that Māori data be stored here in this country is a tension point with government agencies, and other Indigenous peoples are looking closely to see how that particular issue is gonna work out. Another part of this rangatiratanga or authority principle is that of self-determination, and that's having the right data that's relevant and empowers our own sustainable self-determination and effective self-governance. And this is just another one of our principles. Like I said, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I wanted to highlight this one because I think it really sort of illustrates a key point of difference in an Indigenous and certainly a Māori data approach, which is really that the collective is at the forefront, and most of the discourse, policies, practices, processes, regulatory mechanisms in this data space are really all focused on the premise of the rights of the individuals. So it's personal data control, personal data rights, personal data consent, privacy, trust, and so forth. Here, what we see surfacing much more clearly is collective rights. And we go so far as to say that actually, in some contexts, the rights of the collective will prevail over the rights of individuals, and that creates some tension, and it is to be tested in some, it has yet to be sort of fully tested in a legal sense when it comes to data, but it's certainly an issue that won't go away and that will continue to have to be addressed in particular and in different ways. And the final one is around accountabilities, and that Māori, those who are responsible for the stewardship, the management, access, security and dissemination of Māori data, they're actually accountable to the communities and the groups from whom the data derives. So, you know, transparency and accountability is huge. You know, often what you'll find is that agencies will have a lot of words on a page around accountability, but there's no real mechanism with teeth that provides a tangible and direct loop back to the communities that actually enables them to hold the agencies accountable. And that's a big gap. And it's a really important part of sort of realising some form of data sovereignty. Now, I've been talking mainly about governments, but this could as easily be around multinational corporations. But the focus really around strategy here in Aotearoa, but also in our with our colleagues in other domestic contexts, has really been focusing on state agencies first and foremost, partly because they're the ones that that we have a history with of negotiation with through our treaty relationship, and so it sort of makes sense to focus on the government. But increasingly, having to have these conversations with multinational corporations is actually really important, and that is a little bit of uncharted territory. So if we think about, you know, data sort of sovereignty and data governance as a spectrum rather than a hard, fast yes or no, one of the things that sort of became clear very early on within this area of Indigenous data sovereignty is that, you know, you've got some areas which is very low control, and I think for reasons that we all understand, Facebook is as a context, we have very low control or sovereignty over our data. Here in Aotearoa, a context where Indigenous communities have a very high degree of control over their data is tribal registers. So this is the registers that are controlled by tribes that define their membership, and also are sort of used for the distribution of scholarships, educational scholarships, for example, and health benefits. But it's that in-between grey space, which is a huge space, where there's a lot of opportunity for really robust data governance as a mechanism for being able to realise some form of data sovereignty. And data governance is really where a lot of the focus has been in the last couple of years, trying to get in place really meaningful and strong data governance arrangements to ensure that Māori data is being used in ways that doesn't create individual or community harm, but that also that there's some transparency about the benefits, who's benefiting from the data and how is that actually being realised. So there's been a number of data developments here in the last 3 years, but particularly I would say in the last year or so. So one of these major developments has been what's called the Mana Audite Agreement, Audite meaning sort of equality. And this is an agreement that was developed between the Tribal Leaders Forum, which includes around 80 tribes, and the National Statistics Office, Statistics New Zealand. And this agreement became really important because after the 2018 census, which really didn't go very well at all and produced some very poor quality data for Māori, there's a lot of pressure on the National Statistics Agency to, hey, you know, what are you doing to deliver the data that we actually need? And so this Mana Audite Agreement in some ways has been a game changer because it brings both parties together with sort of equal explanatory power to sort of co-determine a work program around delivering Māori and tribal data. So that's been important, and that's into its second year now. Another important development has been a Māori data sovereignty allocation in Budget 2021, which was announced a couple of weeks ago. It was a relatively modest amount, around $14 million, but it is strategically important in that it sort of recognises that Māori data sovereignty is actually an important dimension that the government needs to pay attention to and actually invest in. And this investment was particularly around building Māori and tribal data infrastructure, which has been identified from all the data sovereignty networks as being incredibly important. Other data developments have been around data linkage, data integration, and data reuse. I don't know if it reached UK shores, but like I said, the 2018 census went really poorly. And what the sort of upshot of that was that more than 30% of Māori were actually missed from the census, and that's huge, and more than 30% of the Pacific community. And of course, you know, there's several purposes of the census, but the one key purpose of the census is that it's meant to be a total population enumeration. So if you miss 30% of the census of the population, you're in trouble. And so a lot of trouble did arise from that. And, really faced with that situation and, the hundreds of millions of dollars that are spent on the census, Stats New Zealand were in a position where they had to figure out, well, how are we going to save the census? And the solution to that was really going into other government data sets, finding people which had not been used in that way before, so other linked government administrative data sets, and basically putting them back into the census. And so that, so the census that the nation entered into ended up changing afterwards and being a very different census that involved much wider use of government data. And there hadn't been a conversation before that, and Stats New Zealand was really relying on their social license and the sort of public acceptability to be able to change the census methodology and bring in a much wider range of government data than the public would have expected. So that has been a massive development. There's very much a strong push to offshore data and to make data open. Like I said, New Zealand is part of the D9 network, and that really defines some of their purpose and some of the emerging conversations around intellectual property rights and where Indigenous intellectual property rights intersects with Indigenous data sovereignty. And this is not just about data around humans, but also data around Indigenous resources as well. So that conversation is playing out. It's in its sort of early stages, but I think it will take us in fascinating directions. I just wanted to show here to acknowledge, I've talked about the Maori Data Sovereignty Network, but in the recent years, a really important actor in this space has been the Tribal Leaders Forum, and they have both set up a data trust here called Te Kahui Rārunga, and they've also got a data iwi leadership group, which is a group that focuses specifically on data as being fundamental to tribal governance, and they have a group of technicians that support them, and I'm one of those technicians. And there's been 3 projects that have come about through this Tribal Forums group. One is the Mana Auditi Agreement, which I talked about with the National Statistics Office, which has been a bit of a game changer. The other one has been what's called Te Whata, which is a customizable data platform, which is actually being built by tribal technicians for tribes to support their self-determining decision-making. This has been really interesting because it's basically taken data out of Stats New Zealand, which, like I said earlier, it was sort of known as being a very conservative data gatekeeper, and put it into another space in a way, and that space is being purpose-built and designed with the needs of tribes in mind. And it's been designed by and led by tribal technicians, bringing in non-Indigenous data scientists to help and assist. And the final one, which I just want to highlight, is this Māori data governance model. And this has been really interesting. It's in its second stage. The first stage involved a lot of consultation. It's basically a co-determined model between Māori organisations and tribes on one hand, and Crown agencies that have a strong interest in data on the other hand. So it's a treaty-based, relationship-based, co-determined approach to data governance. And this Māori data governance model, which is now entering its second phase of co-determination, will actually be used across all government-held data. So not just Māori data, but all government-held data. And the thinking there is that if we can get this right for Indigenous peoples who have been so poorly served by data systems and have been at the pointy end of data harm, if we can begin to create a governance and ethical approach that actually works well for them, then that should actually work well for the rest of the country. So that's been an interesting sort of expansion of the scope, I think, of Indigenous data sovereignty and Māori data sovereignty in this context. And everyone's kind of watching to see how that's going to pan out. Okay, so I had talked earlier about this kind of global network of networks, and this is the Global Indigenous Data Sovereignty. And this was formed a couple of years ago in Onyati, which is in the Basque Country. We had a workshop there. I think it was kind of an appropriate place for such a network to be born. There's a lot of activities that go on in the GIDA space. The networks meet regularly and produce resources. There was a lot of incredible amount of advocacy during the pandemic. I won't go into all the sort of details, but I think just this is the a resource that probably GIDA is most well known for, and GIDA's only really been around for a couple of years now. And these are the care principles for Indigenous data governance. There is the GIDA website there, I'll put the URL. And the care principles really stand, there's a lot underneath this, which I don't have time to talk about today, but feel free to go to the website and look at it. But the care principles really stand for kind of the fundamentals of Indigenous data governance. And they are C for collective benefit, A for authority to control, R for responsibility, and E for ethics. And it's interesting how these care principles have actually been sort of rapidly adopted. They don't really sort of challenge, they're not at the strong end of sovereignty. For the most part, they've been sort of being implemented across data collections, which the state or other organisations already have sort of control over, but they've been sort of used in ways that that enable them, those who are stewarding Indigenous data, to do so in a way that's much more sort of transparent and accountable. So it doesn't give data back to communities per se, but what it does is try to ensure that the data that is being held externally is being held in a way which is consistent with Indigenous principles. And what's been interesting here as well is that the RDA, which is a very well-known global network, already had its pre-existing FAIR principles, which is, you know, findable, I think, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So those are the 4 principles underlining their approach to data. And now the RDA has also endorsed and adopted the care principles to sit alongside their mainstream FAIR principles. So it's be fair and care, which is kind of cute, but you know, it sticks in people's minds. And I think it's, you know, strategically it has been very useful that a global network like RDA sees value and has pretty enthusiastically endorsed the care principles. There's a bunch of other things going on in the GIDA space, including there's a manuscript which I think has been accepted on operationalising the care and FAIR principles at Nature Scientific Data, developing criteria for the sort of implementation of care, so taking it beyond principles to implementation, because you know, we know in the UN context and many other contexts that often we have frameworks and principles and then there's a massive implementation gap. And you know, the implementation gap is real, and so that's sort of a bridge that really does need to be crossed. There's been contribution to development of the IEEE standard on the provenance of Indigenous peoples' data and contribution to the UNESCO Open Science Workshop. So there's a huge amount of activities sort of going on in the space. It's sort of hard to keep up. I'll probably miss some out, but that just gives you a sense of the sort of the diversity of stuff that's going on. Also in the last couple of years, there has been not just nationally, I've talked a lot about what's been happening here in this context, but globally sort of a growing recognition of Indigenous data sovereignty. I've just included here an excerpt from the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Privacy. This is from a international consultation on big data, open data, and the task force report that eventuated from that. I've just taken out some sort of, I think, important quotes. And one is that data are a cultural, strategic, and economic resource for Indigenous peoples. That existing data infrastructure failed to recognise and privilege Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous worldviews, and they do not meet Indigenous needs. And the Special Rapporteur also encouraged governments and corporations to recognise the inherent sovereignty of Indigenous people's data, people over the data about them or collected from them. So that was really heartening to see that very unambiguous statement coming from the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Privacy. Of course, you know, these are sort of global human rights instruments, so there's no compulsion to implement them, but I think they provide a very strong steer to governments and what the expectations are, and certainly those expectations can be followed up by sort of advocacy at the national level. There was also a second paper that came out from the Special Rapporteur, and this was focused on the protection and use of health-related data. This made some stronger statements around Indigenous people's rights to exercise control of health-related data, to decide which sets of health-related data require active governance. And I've just highlighted this part here because it goes back to that idea of the collective and the fundamental importance of the collective, that the collection, the use and interpretation of data shall uphold the dignity of Indigenous communities and groups, and that data processing of health-related data that stigmatises or blames Indigenous peoples can result in collective as well as individual harm, and should be actively avoided. So there's a very clear steer again there about the importance of the collective. And so sort of just resorting to a one-size-fits-all, sort of Western European notion of the primacy of the individual actually misses out a lot of what needs to be protected for Indigenous communities. So just sort of moving a bit to the research aspect. I mean, I think one of the reasons why the Indigenous data sovereignty networks, although very young, have been able to be quite successful in their advocacy is that our advocacy is very evidence and research based. So we sort of marry the advocacy with the research, and that's been quite an effective strategy so far. Recently, we worked together here in Aotearoa, but also involving some of our colleagues overseas to successfully bid for a 4-year, I think it was $6 or $7 million program, which is focused on Indigenous approaches to transforming data ecosystems, which is funded by the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. And it's called Tikanga and Technology. And there's really 3 strands here. I'm not going to deep dive into any of it. It's really just to give you a high level sense of the areas of research that are currently going on in this space. So one of them is around Indigenous data and governance. The focus there has really been on collective privacy, and I'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide, and collective benefit and what that looks like. So we're not really interested in rehashing all of the literature, all of the scholarship, all of the studies on individual privacy and individual data value. It's really the focus on the collective. The second part is around Indigenous data and systems, very much focused on Indigenous methodologies of data classification, of data provenance and data valuation. So if we move away from that highly sort of like extractivist, capitalist sense of the value of the data, what are other ways of valuing data? And how might we build that into our sort of accounting models, but also into our practices. And the third one is around Indigenous data and artificial intelligence. And some of the projects in there are focusing on decolonizing algorithms. Like, that slips off the tongue quite easily, but how do we decolonize algorithms? How, is that even possible? What does that mean? Can you just sort of import decades of theorizing and practice on decolonization into algorithms? Doesn't work. And the sort of flip side of that is around indigenizing artificial intelligence with a focus on natural language processing and natural language generation. So that's a very high level sort of overview of some of the research that's going on. We're in our first year, so we have another 3 years to go. So watch the space. Hopefully lots of good stuff will eventuate from the research. One of the areas that I've been working on a lot is around in this first year is around data privacy, and we're still trying to get a handle on it really. And like I said, privacy has very much been situated as an individual right, and that dominates the discourse, the narratives, the data regulations. But what this does is it really sort of limits the scope of information privacy to concerns about the potential to identify individuals from their data, and we're all well aware of so many examples of that. And just here, a couple of weeks ago, we had a massive breach of our district health board data, and the primary concern was about, can individuals be identified from their data? So underlying this are a whole bunch of assumptions which are often sort of glossed over. Capitalist assumptions about privacy as a value to be sort of traded off, and it's subsumed by market logic. Often the approach to privacy is very ethnocentric, so it's sort of oriented to privacy attitudes and behaviours of white sort of middle-class demographics from the studies that have been conducted. The data, but this is really out of step in so many ways with the emerging sort of environment and rapidly expanding potential for data and analytics, which is not so much about individuals, but very much interested in identifying clusters and groups, whether those groups are self-defined or whether those groups are defined ad hoc by data analysts who have a particular interest in risk often, or in characteristics which expose people to risk, or organisations or those with resources to risk. So the current approach to privacy is not fit for purpose, not just for Indigenous peoples, but for many communities. And we can think of a number of examples, which we'll be including as case studies in our research, where an individual-focused approach to privacy really doesn't work. One, of course, is around DNA, where the information of others is encoded in the individual's DNA, and another is around genealogical information. I'll just talk a little bit about more of that to close. And another example that no doubt is being carried out as well in the UK is community surveillance versus grey water testing. Here it's conducted with the national, with police around wastewater testing for drugs. But of course, during the pandemic, wastewater testing was also carried out for COVID-19. So we want to look at what Indigenous approaches to data protection and sharing might look like from a collectivist approach, and how might an Indigenous privacy approach begin to address some of the challenges that I've very briefly talked about. Okay, almost getting to the end. Thank you. I hope everyone's staying awake. Very mindful and grateful that you tuned in at such a late hour. So I just want to end by sort of shifting gear a little bit. And I've talked a lot about trying to move from data dependency and data colonialism to data sovereignty. And there's real limits to that, I think. And essentially, I guess the position that I've come to arrive at, along with some of my colleagues, including Dr. Cormack, who I write with a lot, is that the fullness of Indigenous data sovereignty can't ever really truly be recognised within the architecture of the colonial settler state. In Aotearoa, along with other Kansas states, Australia, Canada and the United States, the approach to Indigenous policy has long been to contain and manage, rather than to enable genuine forms of Indigenous self-determination or autonomy. So why would it be any different for data? So to give full effect to Indigenous data sovereignty, that is for Indigenous peoples to determine the means of collection, access, analysis, interpretation, management, dissemination and reuse of data from or pertaining to them, requires a level of Indigenous power and autonomy that does not currently exist within state systems. So this is a real barrier to realising a substantive form of data sovereignty. So what we need perhaps is a radical alternative to the colonial project that sits outside of settler state structures. And to realise, I guess, the substance rather than the shadow of Indigenous data sovereignty here in Aotearoa, Māori need to be able to freely determine the shape and the form of our data ecosystems. And the foundations of these systems need to be built on our own, what we call tikanga, ethical principles, practices, and processes for what is tika or right in a given context. It needs to be built on our mātauranga Māori, which is our knowledge systems and ways of knowing, and it needs to be built on our own priorities. So I just want to finish very briefly with talking about a very small attempt at a radical alternative amongst my own people, Ngāti Tipa. And so Ngāti Tipa are one of the 33 tribes and sub-tribes that make up the Waikato Tainui Confederation, on whose land this university sits. And if you follow this river, this blue windy river, that's our ancestral river, the Waikato River, it flows out to the Tasman Sea and over to Australia, and that is where Ngāti Tipa is situated. So if you've been to New Zealand before, in Auckland, it's just south of Auckland. So what have we been doing in Ngāti Tipa? We're a very small, modest hapu or sub-tribe where you don't have a lot of resources. We have a lot of smart people who like to think innovatively. And what we've embarked on through a research project is basically a massive exercise on data repatriation and repurposing. And so this is a photo of my dad here, who's poring over a massive genealogical table that we found in the National Library, the Alexander Turnbull Library. And basically for 3 years, we've been going into all public repositories and repatriating our data, taking out a bunch of iPhones and basically finding every bit of material that we could find relating to Ngāti Tipa, digitising it, and then taking it back into our space. So this include photos. This photo on the bottom left-hand side is a photo of one of our chiefs who presided over Ngāti Tipa between about 1840 and the mid-1860s, just at the time that our land was being invaded and confiscated through legal acts and land wars where many people lost their lives. It includes massive genealogical tables like the one that my dad is poring over, which covers about, gosh, I don't know, about 6 tables. It was incredibly long. Huge amount of detailed information that we've been able to use. Includes newspaper reports from historical newspapers. Māori were great writers, and so there's so many letters and archival materials, and of course land deeds and so forth. So it's a huge diversity, lots and lots of maps of material that we've been able to source from public repositories, digitize, and take them back into our own space. So what do our own spaces look like? These are our tribal meeting houses. These were our original data warehouses. So we have carvings on them that tell our stories, our creation stories, our connections to each other and to our environment. The tuku and the kōwhaiwhai that are inside our whare tau hold so much of our mātauranga, our knowledge around our places, our belief systems, our ways of being and doing. And these are the appropriate places in many ways for us to take back our repatriated data and repurpose them with our community. And that's what we've done over the last couple of years. Everything that and Dad's holding a massive genealogical table that he's created from all the integration of all these other data sources that we've been able to put together. And, you know, you can't do that from a technical sense. You need to have the customary knowledge. And so, you know, our families may not have the sort of latest data technical skills, but they hold an incredible amount of knowledge without which this sort of exercise just can't be done. So they've been absolutely fundamental, and they've actually been at the centre of this research project. So we've repurposed the data in our own spaces with input from our family. They're always open and inclusive. They're not limited to anyone who is from Ngāti Tipa, and we all are genealogically connected to our eponymous ancestor who lived around the mid-17th century. So we all share a genealogical connection to our common ancestor. Anybody who has that can come to our meetings. We have a lot of fun, a bit of crying, a lot of fun. And of course, you can't just repatriate a whole load of data and put it back together. You need to have tikanga. You need to have the ethical rules and guidance and basis for how we use this, how we put it together, how it gets used not only by current generations, but by future generations. And when we've had tikanga wānanga or thought spaces around the ethics, it's all the women who turn up across all the generations, our queer who are in their 80s, some of them near 90, this teenager here who's been there right from the outset, and she's amazing. She carries an ancestral name. She has a vested interest in making sure that this data is protected. And so we've had these wonderful workshops where we all sit collectively and figure out which data can people access, under what context, for what purposes, what happens. Do we give them the data, or do we only give them part of the data? So all those different scenarios have been worked through in quite granular detail. And where we've got to now, and I make my second to last slide, is we've created what we call a digital pātaka or storehouse. And this is just a very sort of simple layer cake explanation that was developed by one of our Ngāti Tipa technologists who we've had very fortunate to not only issue my relation, but she works in our project as well. It's basically a by family for family project in a very grand sense of the term family. And so she's developed this model that, you know, people can just readily understand. It's been wonderful. And she's been able to work alongside non-Indigenous data scientists to get them to do the work that we need. And so we have the digitized data, genealogical data, very important, very sacred in some ways. We have land maps, GIS, we have photos, we have captured our elders' stories and the traditional knowledges, we have songs and all these different kinds of data. That's the data. Then we have a pātaka or repository, which we've purposefully sort of bespoke designed, and we have absolutely non-negotiable that the servers must be in this country, consistent with Māori data sovereignty principles. We have our tikanga and the access permissions, and then we have our applications, which are web-based, and we're currently working with a non-Indigenous kind of world-leading cryptographer to make sure that our once we open our web-based tribal digital repository, that it can't be broken into and that the data will be kept safe from a data security perspective. So, you know, if you want things to be done properly, we have no, you know, we're quite open to bringing in experts who are not Indigenous, who are not from our community, to do the work on the community's behalf. So I just want to end there. None of this could have been possible with the support and the vision of our old people. These are some of our elders from our Ngāti Tipa community who have since passed. They were there at the first hui, the first meeting that we had, in the front row. And I often reflect on that. Why were they there? They were there because they saw a vision for hope. I think change and self-determination. So I'll finish there, and thank you so much for staying with me. I know I've gone a bit over time. I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Tahu. That was brilliant. Thank you for giving us the basics first, and giving us this map to understand the problem in general and how it specifically plays out in the context of Aotearoa, and then getting into those fascinating details about the different kinds of data and about the different the alternative that you're developing to not only become sovereign over the actual data, but the use of the data in completely different ways. So that's really absolutely fascinating. I'm going to